Allison Caine is a cultural anthropologist here at UW, and she focuses on climate change, animal-based livelihood, health, and well-being. And most of her research has been focused in Peru in the Andes, on pastoral alpaca herders. Women are the primary pastoralists in that area, and the area has been experiencing a lot of climate change impacts with deglaciation. They're right in the mountain. Other work that she has done has been with sheep herders here in Wyoming and on sociolinguistic history research in the Amazon when she was doing her postdoc. Dr. Caine is currently working on a book about her research in Peru, which I am really excited to read.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to Dr. Bennett for inviting me to be here today. It's really great to be able to get outside of the Anthropology building, meet some other folks across campus, and share a bit of the research that I've been up to for the past rough decade or so. So the presentation today is going to represent some of the research that I've been conducting in the Southern Peruvian Andes. I've been documenting broadly the impacts of global climate change on high elevation glacier descendant communities in the Andes Mountains. And at the broadest level, I'm asking how herders there are gathering information about the changes to their ecosystem and how they're modifying their practices in response. But I'm really trying to answer these questions within the particular cultural and understandings that people have there about what sort of makes up the world, how those relationships are changing, and how we can create viable futures under the emerging conditions. So in the next 40-ish minutes or so, I'm going to touch briefly on why I do the work that I do, why I think anthropology and the social sciences more broadly are really critical in our contributions to understanding a changing world. And I'm going to talk about how that sort of broad lens informs my research questions around climate change and well-being in the Andes and elsewhere. Then I'll give some background on where I did this research and how I did this research, so the methods that I use to understand high elevation glacier dependent pastoralist systems. And then I will discuss the results of this research, what it reveals about indigenous ecological knowledge in the Andes, specifically in terms of how people understand their relationship to animals and relationships to landscapes changing under conditions of environmental stress and landscape fragmentation. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about how I envision sort of future research in this area and also here in Wyoming related to similar themes. So my broader research program is really built on an inherently collaborative model. I really think that if we want to understand a phenomenon like climate change, we have to integrate a diversity of perspectives. So in my own research, I'm trying to connect these really granular experience near methods with longitudinal studies of landscape change over time to get that holistic understanding of what is happening to mountain ecosystems under a changing climate. So on the ground, this involves collaborating with a team of climate scientists. I work with indigenous community representatives. We're bringing all of these various lines of data together to try to inform future decisions in that landscape. And I think social scientists play a very critical role in that conversation because there are a number of things that social scientists do best, right? We draw attention to those everyday practices through which people strive to live well under changing conditions. We also focus on that every day to generate important insights that can then be brought to bear on critical questions around policy, around governance, adaptation, around justice in a time of climate change. And these on-the-ground perspectives can highlight a lot of the misalignments that occur between environmental policies and daily practices, specifically to clarify which and most importantly, whose knowledge is being represented in these broader strategies to address global climate change. So with that big picture kind of goal in mind, my research in the Andes was grounded in two essential questions. So how do people evaluate changes in the world around them, specifically within their own cultural understandings of how the world works, right? How do they strategize in response? So how do people continue to live? How do they continue to live well in changing landscapes? So to locate ourselves geographically, my doctoral research took place in a mountain range, which is called the Cordillera del Canota. It's in southeastern Peru, right there, kind of near the Bolivian border. And as you can see from this satellite image, it is a highly glaciated mountain chain. So there are roughly 470 glaciers encompassed within the Vilcanota, including the Calcaya ice cap, which is the largest in the tropics. And I was based in the community of Chilca, which is sort of on the southern flanks of Mount Ausangate, which is the largest mountain within this mountain chain. So of course, glacier retreat is one of the most visible signs of climate change in this region. In the past 50 years, we have seen a 40% reduction in Peru's glacial cover. And recent predictions show that in the Vilcanota specifically, they could lose up to 90% of their permanent ice cover by 2090 under current climatic conditions. Chilca is one of the communities that relies on those glaciers for their well-being, for their livelihoods. So I was in the community of Chilca between 2015, 2016. It's a small community of about 350 people, about 90 families. They are all indigenous Quechua speakers, although some people do speak Spanish. They live at an elevation of 4,400 meters, which is about 14,400 feet. So if you can imagine, that's double Laramie, so very, very high up. That means that they do not have much agriculture in this region, right? They grow a few varieties of potato. Of course, when I say a few varieties, in Peru, there are over 2,000 varieties of potato. They grow about 250. But mostly they rely on their grazing animals for their subsistence and for their income. Each family has a mixed herd of 3 different animals. They have alpacas, which are the animals of primary importance. They are bred historically for their wool. The community sells this wool every year in November, and that provides sort of the main source of income, not only for families, but also for the community at large, which has sort of a community herd. They also have llamas, which work mainly as pack animals. So they're bringing potatoes from the farm to the storage house. They're also helping with some of these tourist treks that go around Ausangate Mountain, where they carry backpacks and things like that. And then they've got sheep, which also provide wool and meat, but mostly for household consumption. I like to think of sheep as sort of like their, if you think about in terms of a, like, what do you call it? A savings versus, what's the other one? Checking, thank you. I was trying to say credit. So if you think about it like a checking versus a savings account, your sheep are going to be your checking account. It's quick cash. Your alpacas are going to be your savings accounts or long-term savings. So it is notable to mention that pastoralism is traditionally women's work in this part of the world, or Warnihuay in Quechua. It's not exclusively women's work, but women mainly do this labor, and even more so now that a lot of the community's men are involved in things like wage labor and tourism. So coming from a Western perspective, we often assume that men are the pastoralists, right? That men are doing animal husbandry, right? We even have a very gendered language to talk about it. And this means that women's work in pastoralism is often underrepresented in both the research on the Andes and also these development projects that are cropping up to address problems like climate change. So women are involved in both the daily and seasonal work of herding animals. This is just a fun little video showing a herding route one day in 2015. Unfortunately, the sort of like kilometer measurement didn't transfer, but it's about, in total, it's about like 6 miles. So basically women every day are bringing the animals to pasture. They're circulating them through the available wetlands and the grasslands. They're preventing them from crossing boundaries into other sectors of the community. It's very laborious work. As you can see, you are running around a lot trying to keep animals contained within these glacial valleys. While women are doing that, they're also doing other types of work. They're scanning the herd for signs of disease. They're diagnosing and treating illnesses. They are monitoring the health of the grasslands, tracking the availability, the quality of water. And critically, they are often sharing their observations and exchanging herding labor with other women with whom they share pastures. So you can imagine there's one woman on one side of that valley with her animals, another woman on the other side of the valley with her animals, and they're kind of shouting across the ridgetop about, how the day is going, how the grasslands are looking, how their animals are. And this is a really important sort of network of knowledge and resource sharing that's really vital to responding to different types of ecological stress. So the primary way that people in this part of the world respond to ecological stress is through migration, or something that we call transhumance, pastoral transhumance. So in this region, they traditionally practice a rotational system in which they move between closely located pastures at higher and lower elevations. So this is different from other parts of the world where they are moving herds across long sort of tracts of landscape, right? They're usually moving within a few miles from these high sort of wetlands to low rain-fed pastures. So what this looks like is that during the dry season, which happens between May and October, there's very little precipitation. Herders are moving to their high pastures up there to access those glacier-fed wetlands, right? And then during the wet season, which is November to April, they come back down to the low pastures to graze on those rain-fed grasses. Basically, as soon as the rains come back, those grasses start looking better. That's when they move all their animals back down. So when I began my field work in 2015, 2016, the pastures here were held as a commons. And so these migrations were managed within various sort of sectors of the community. So it was multiple families working together to decide where and when to take their animals. So part of my research at that time, I'm just going to touch on this briefly today, mostly because my maps are terrible, but I was mapping these migrations in as close detail as I possibly could. So this is a map of where families' residences and pastures were located by season. So the red indicates the dry season pasture, the blue indicates the wet season pasture, and then this yellow part was an area where families didn't rotate pastures because they had sort of fewer animals there. And people generally, what I found when I was living there is that people generally followed that expected pattern, right? So in the dry season, families were moving up to those high pastures located on the outer ring of the community where all those glaciers were. And then in the wet season, they were moving back down to their low pastures in the Central Valley. However, I started to notice during the period of time that I was living there that there was this constant kind of year-round negotiation of mobility patterns among the families in each sector. So they would either decide to return to seasonal pastures in the off-season for periods of time, or they might even create sort of new offshoot pastures or temporary residences to kind of release pressure on certain areas. And it became very clear that this sort of flexible mobility, this way of moving around sort of in constant contact with your neighbors, was a key adaptive strategy that allowed them to adjust to all of these seasonal fluctuations in precipitation and in pasture availability. But instead of looking at this system, as it often is, as simply sort of a reactionary response to ecological stress, I really wanted to dig a bit deeper into the sort of cultural logics that underpinned this whole system, right? I wanted to know what kinds of knowledge inform those decisions to migrate. Oh. Yeah. It works. All right. Okay. So I wanted to know what kinds of knowledge women were using to make those decisions, right? What methods were they using to sense that the grasslands were no longer viable, that it was time to move their animals, that they needed to talk to their neighbors and start thinking about what their migration for the next few months was going to look like. So to get at that kind of more granular question, I needed to use sort of a spectrum of methods over the course of a year that I lived there. So I lived in the community of Chilka between 2015 and 2016. I did kind of what we call immersive fieldwork in anthropology, right? So I showed up to the community, I presented myself at the community assembly in Quechua, said, hi, I want to study Quechua and alpacas and live with you for a period of time. They put it to a vote, they said yes, and then they gave me a little storage house in the center of their community. Within 3 days, this older woman approached me and was like, if you live here by yourself, you will die. You must come live with me. And so she took me into her household and I started living and working with her. Eventually got to know all of her kin, started working with them, and eventually went out kind of further into the community, would visit people for a few days, herd animals with them, kind of come back and forth. I eventually did do some herding myself once I was deemed competent, but I was never trusted with alpacas. I was always given the sheep, again, like the quick cash. That was my area of expertise. But in addition to doing a lot of that sort of collaborative mapping that I was showing earlier, I also conducted a number of interviews in Quechua, so the language that they speak there, a language that I studied for 3 years before I went at the University of Michigan. And many of those interviews took the form of sort of transect walks, right? So you're walking through the landscape with herders and you try to capture this mobile storytelling about what's kind of happening in the world around you as you're moving through the landscape. I also used an audio recorder to catalog this broad repertoire of whistles and vocalizations that women use with their animals, which actually became really relevant, as I'll explain later. And so those were most of my core methods. And then I had a GPS unit, so I could see where I was going. Oh, wow, just one delay.
Sorry,
So the general results of my research there showed a critical insight, which is that Quechua women produce highly detailed, highly diverse forms of socio-ecological knowledge through their daily immersive interactions with animals and landscapes of the high Andes. And this body of knowledge informs those broader adaptive strategies that the community as a whole relies on in the face of transformative changes to their landscape. So many of the most concerning changes that women were observing related specifically to two things. The first was to shifting precipitation patterns, right? So not just, I want to get us away from thinking just about glacial retreat as being like the primary thing that people are seeing, although they do see it all the time. But they were noticing shifting precipitation patterns. And then they were also noticing these really detailed changes in socio-ecological relationships. So relationships between humans and animals and humans and landscapes. And I'm going to dig down into what that means. So first, in terms of precipitation, according to people in Chilka, they were starting to see changes in both the intensity and the timing of precipitation in recent decades. So this is just a sort of short summary of a variety of things that I was hearing at the time. But generally, I was hearing that the rains were no longer arriving at their proper time. Sometimes it seemed like weather patterns were flipping, right? When it should rain, the frost come. When it should rain, the drought comes, right? When it is raining, it should be dry, things like that. And people also noted a change in intensity, right? So in the past, the rain was calm. The rain and snow weren't as much. Now the hail beats down terribly. It wasn't like that before. So everything was just becoming a bit more intense, a bit stronger. Of course, climate scientists working in the Vilcanota were also picking up on this. So this is data gathered at a nearby weather station where we see an extended period of drought and the delayed onset of the wet season in late 2015. So the same sort of phenomena that people are noticing. And what this meant for the herders is that they had to delay their migrations between pastures that year. So this is kind of a wonky depiction of what a sort of monthly migration pattern would look like over the course of a year for 12 households in one particular sector of the community. Basically, this shows where people told me they would be in which season between July 2015 and July 2016. So as we see in the dry season, people reported they would be in their high pastures, which are red. And then in the wet season, we see that they would be in their low pastures, which are green. This blue box is showing that seasonal transition. So as people kind of anticipated it, right? So people would move to their wet season pastures right at the onset of the wet season. So they were guessing around late October, early November. And then this shows what actually happened for those 12 households. So all you really need to know about this is that it looks very different than the previous one, right? There's a lot of moving around. There was, of course, that major delay for most people within that time period, that seasonal shift. And then there was this sort of purple area, which was an unexpected offshoot pasture that people had to move to kind of reduce stress on their other grasslands, right? So very unexpected, demonstrating a lot of that sort of adaptive flexibility, a lot of the sort of dynamic system as it was unfolding. But something I found really intriguing is that women were also reporting these changes in the ways that humans and animals were interacting in these extended drought conditions. So generally, when I asked herders how they knew it was time to move their pastures, I always got the same answer, which is manaharkaita atikuju. We can't control or obstruct the animals. And this verb harkai is very interesting. It is a verb that you would use to like obstruct a canal such that you change where the water goes, right? It's that sort of sense of interacting with something dynamic that's already moving such that you kind of gently urge it in another direction, which kind of tells you a lot about how people work with their animals, right? They're not driving the herds, they're often kind of helping redirect movement that's already going, right? And I really wanted to take this statement very seriously, to think about the ways that women consider the animals themselves as central interlocutors in detecting and evaluating ecological stress in the world around them. So each herder has a rich vocabulary of whistles that they use. Each whistle or vocalization corresponds to a specific species of animal and tells that animal to do a desired action, right? To move forward, to come back, to stop, to redirect. It is so precise that I have seen a 12-year-old girl kind of walk into a mixed herd of llamas, alpacas, and sheep and kind of take all of the sheep out without moving any of the other animals, just through these vocalizations alone. They're very precise. This is called a spectrogram. It shows the pitch of this one specific whistle that herders use, and they use this specifically with llamas that they want to move forward. So it's this short ascending whistle, and then at the end, it's this kind of harsh, like, sound. Unfortunately, a real drawback to me doing this field work is that I can't whistle. So I can't demonstrate any of these things, but if you can imagine, it's just like a quick little like that sort of thing, and that will get the llama to move forward. And this repertoire of whistling, of verbal commands, is how people really keep things running smoothly, right? However, in drought conditions, women in Chilco were starting to notice that the animals were not listening to them. They couldn't rely on the animals as communicative partners anymore. They stopped listening. They started wandering off. They were using the same repertoire of whistles and commands, but they weren't getting the expected response. And in Quechua, they have a language for this type of communicative or relational failure. So the herders refer to this unresponsiveness, or to their unresponsive animals, as kita. And I translate kita into English as restlessness, because it describes a state of agitation, of bodily sort of unwellness, or kind of, what would you say, sort of like accelerated, agitation. That's evidenced by unpredictable movement, right? So things like wandering. People used it with animals, but they also use it to describe intoxicated people that stumble around or stagger or swerve without direction. And generally they use it to indicate that there's a social being that is acting outside of the expectations of their social relations, right? So social relations between you and this other being have broken down because they are drunk and wandering, or they're bewitched and wandering, or they are hungry and wandering, right? So to understand why Kita, why this restlessness is so significant, it's really important to know a little bit more about Quechua ontologies, right, or worldviews, how people kind of put the world together there. So in Quechua communities like Chilca, there is not a clear separation between kind of nature and culture in the same way as we would think about it in the West, right? So people, animal beings, landscape beings, they are all social. They communicate with one another. They literally talk to one another. So mountains talk to humans, humans talk to mountains, mountains talk to animals, vice versa. They also feed one another through things like offerings, or if you're a mountain to animals, things like rain that produce the pastures. They're bound to each other in reciprocal obligation. And that sort of reciprocal obligation, those relationships are what hold the world together. So what this means is that one's well-being, or ayin kausai in the Andes, is inherently relational. To be well, if you are a human, if you're an animal, if you're a landscape, is to be kept in relation to this multitude of social beings with which you share your world, right? So to be fed, to be talked to be listened to. So this quote here, Andean herders conceptualize their land management systems as spheres of relations and lines of interaction, right? So when you are dealing with a landscape like this, you need to be aware that the people there manage relations rather than resources. That's what their system looks like. And indeed, in addition to the breakdown in relationships between humans and animals, people were also sensing changes between humans and the landscape as well. So, for example, this is an older woman, Victoria, who described how humans used to relate to the landscape in very different ways. We used to make offerings to the earth here. Now the earth isn't remembered. So younger generations, she's saying, no longer acknowledge those social relationships with the landscape, right? It's just forgotten, it's lost. She uses a verb that's sort of like tossed out. And she actually connects this to the extreme weather events that are happening. So pucaras are the mountain beings in Chilca. She's saying now that we don't remember the pucaras, we don't give them offerings, we don't talk to them, they are raining down their bullets on us. And she uses the Spanish word for bullets to describe hail, right? Killing animals and people. Furthermore, in 2016, so towards the end of the time that I was there were repeated disputes about wandering animals, about animals crossing boundaries, about people not obstructing their animals well, right? Not doing haikai well. And this erupted into a community-wide discussion of land privatization in Chilca. So many people, mostly the younger generation, voted to dissolve the commons. So get rid of this communal pasture management system by which they were coordinating with neighbors to move their animals to the landscape, in favor of adopting a privatized model of land tenure, such that each family would only have their parcel. It would be fenced off. They would just have their animals within that parcel. But a lot of the older generation voted against this for many reasons, right? And they found these conversations to be especially painful. So I often heard people say things like, if this happens, the community will disappear. You know, people will wonder what happened to the community of Chilca. People said all the animals will die, all the land will disappear, the animals will get sold off, the land could get sold off to mining companies or to tourist ventures, for example. And the older generation really felt that they were going to be left behind if this happened. So an older gentleman said to me, I think it would be sad if we privatized, right? because we've lived this life. I don't know other types of work. I've only herded animals and farmed potatoes in the chakra. That's all I know. I haven't studied either. He continues on. If I had studied, I would be living in a city, even just cleaning houses, but I don't know this type of work. I don't know how to read, only just a little. Parcelization, privatization wouldn't be good because people haven't thought it through. I don't want it. So that's what a lot of the sort of older generation was feeling. And they were really seeing it again as this sort of the further breakdown of that broader kind of social and ecological community that made up what is Chilka, right? So I had limited contact with the community after I left. At that time, there was no electricity up there. There was no cell phone signal. Also, people don't generally tend to talk about sensitive issues over the phone, right? It's much more like, hi, how are you? How are the kids? I also didn't make it back for a long time, right? So I left in 2016. I had a couple kids, pandemic happened, and I finally made it back this year, so 7 years later. And I found out that they did end up privatizing their land in about 2019. So from the reports of people in the community, it was an incredibly painful process. It involved like 24 community assemblies. People were crying, people were fighting. And as one woman said, it was shocking. You know, now you can't walk through the hillsides like before. There are fences everywhere. Of course, there were people who reported on the benefits of this system. They were able to sell off a lot of the community's alpacas, which meant they were able to use that money to build new roads. A lot of people felt really positively about this because it meant that they could reach their schools or reach their homes in a shorter period of time. You know, before there were some women in the community that were walking 6 hours with their children to get to school. And so those folks were feeling much better about this particular system. Also, women were saying, you know, I don't have to run 8 or 12 miles a day after my animals. It's much calmer. We can just watch them within our own parcels. There are fewer conflicts between neighbors. But of course, people also reported major downsides, right? They reported that they were worried about the community becoming more vulnerable to mining, to extractive industries, now that they had a different land tenure system. Older people were worried about that loss of landscape knowledge, saying their kids didn't know the names of the mountains anymore. They didn't know the names of the landscape features. And then of course there was that loss of those robust knowledge networks because people weren't just meeting up in the pastures anymore to chat about their animals, about the grasslands. They were mostly stuck within their parcels. And so women reported feeling very lonely and really missed kind of that opportunity to spend time with folks in the community. Also from, you know, an outside perspective, there's things like the loss of wildlife corridors. They've fenced off all of these areas. So there's a lot that has changed quite dramatically. And that leads to a lot of questions about what Chilka's future could look like. I'm hoping to continue my work, especially with elders in that community. And I'm specifically interested in taking up a lot of those threads around kind of socio-ecological well-being and what it feels like to live within a place that has experienced that sort of dissolution of landscape and human-animal relations, especially to think sort of critically about what it means to live and to live well in that landscape. So these questions emerged kind of early in my fieldwork, in my conversations with herders in Chilka, many of whom were older women. As these older women were kind of reckoning with all of the ways that the world was changing, they were also talking about the sort of felt and embodied experience of those changes. So as glaciers are retreating, younger generations are moving away, older women started to report these kind of changing sensations in their bodies. So kind of like changing feelings around cold and heat, fatigue or agitation, pain, numbness in various parts of their bodies. And they interpreted this as a sort of weakening of their own bodily and social existence. So drawing from sort of medical and ecological approaches to health and healing, I'm really interested in knowing more about how women kind of diagnose themselves, how they get diagnosed by others, how they codify these symptoms into some sort of discrete illness, right? There were a few kind of names floating around. One was PC Yawar, which is literally a lack of blood. which I think kind of overlaps conceptually with anemia. Cambio vida, which is life change, overlaps conceptually with menopause. But they also really exceed those categories, and they kind of express a lot of this broader embodied experience of social and ecological vulnerability. So in my future research, I'm interested in exploring those questions further, both in Chilca, as well as in the sort of chains of migration that are now leading out of Chilca. I'm interested in knowing how climate change induced migration is shaping the ways that people and communities feel, understand their own health, their well-being. And I'm interested in following a lot of those chains of migration as they lead to places like Wyoming. So since the 1990s, Quechua-speaking Peruvian herders have been recruited for their pastoralist expertise to come and work on sheep ranches in the Western United States, specifically through the H-2A visa program. They're mostly young and middle-aged men. I can talk about the dynamics of that later, but there are a few existing ethnographic studies of Peruvian sheep herders in the United States, one of which from 2006 speaks to their experience of being in this landscape away from their homelands and in the Quechua language. So from this study, we know that Peruvian herders in Colorado, Wyoming, often describe themselves as Wakcha. So this is a term that translates roughly to orphan. It also kind of means poor. It describes this sort of particular type of displacement that one can feel when you were separated from your communities, your landscapes of origins. And so questions that I would have if I were to do this future research in the Western US is, how do migrant herders adapt to these different social and ecological landscapes? Do they shift their practices of engagement with animals and landscapes? Do they talk to landscapes and animals, and how? I know from talking to the person who wrote that 2006 report that although many of these herders are now Spanish speakers, they still talk to the animals in Quechua. So Quechua is still the language of engagement between humans and animals. I want to know more about how Quechua herders strive to live well in places like Wyoming, right? What challenges exist in this new landscape around things like healthcare services, social services for migrant workers, participating in this type of precarious labor that often draws them very far away from their communities. So that is all I have for you all today. I am excited to hear your questions and comments and talk with you a bit further about things that might have piqued your interest. But thank you so much again for having me and for giving me the opportunity to share all of this with you.
Minutes for questions.
So you talked about the pros and the cons of when the land was privatized and fragmented. Do you personally feel like that led to an overall loss of adaptive capacity for the community?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think overall living in community, especially in these types of landscapes, has shown itself to be a very adaptive form of living in an environment that is heavily right away, but that experiences ecological change quite regularly, as the Andes does. And so I think especially in seeing that breakdown of those networks of knowledge, of people kind of abandoning alpacas and moving towards wage labor and other things, I think that puts the community in a bit of a pickle. They've also had some transitions to working in tourism that haven't gone extremely well. Many of you may know of like Rainbow Mountain in Peru. You might have seen the pictures of it. So that's kind of like outside of this community. And for a while there was this viral sort of boom in which everyone wanted to come and see the Rainbow Mountain. They started to shift their economy towards tourism for that. And then the pandemic happened. And so it was just sort of, they kind of fell back on that. So generally, I think this system is going to be very challenging for this community moving forward. And I do share a lot of the concerns around, you know, what this community will look like in 10, 20 years. Yeah. Mhm.
With the, I guess, do you know when people really started moving towards wage labor, or how far in advance to you spending time that was? And how much that potentially changed the demographic in the community, if there were, and I guess the historical implication of that, and then potentially future implication of if you have male pastoral herders working in other countries or people leaving, and if the younger generation has sort of left as well.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So people started to work more in sort of regional town centers or with these tourism operators starting in about the 1990s, 2000s. And it's really increased since then. A lot of people there actually blame this sort of privatization on wage labor because people started to be able to kind of buy their way out of community like work events. Like you all come together and you shear the alpacas, or you all come together, you do work on the pastures, things like that. And people started to be able to have cash to essentially pay the fines for not showing up. And so people were just kind of buying their way out of that community management system. But yeah, I would say now it's increasing such that a good portion of the community, the younger generation, they do not see themselves coming back. There are a few, but not many, which kind of gets a mixed response in Chilca. There's sort of this concern about Chilca being overcrowded. And then there's also this kind of norm of patriarchality there, such that women will typically leave the community and go live with their husband's family. And then just the kind of the male offspring will stay. So yeah, it's a mixed bag in terms of how that has impacted the community overall. Yeah, Liz.
So maybe Emma's question into demographics answers this, but like I was thinking, how have you framed this in terms of like twilight of the common pool resources in this community? And so interesting that you had your work data collected before and after this. But I'm wondering what, you've had this time, and what are the big forces you think? Did the common pool system fail the community in some way that enabled this opportunity for demographic changes to overcome it? Or how have you come to terms with this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one thing I found interesting is that, I, of course, like living in community, I consider to be adaptive, but I think we also have this sort of like warm and fuzzy feelings about community, right? Like being in community is so great. We always want to be in community. And people there sometimes were like, living in community sucks. Like I don't want to go to this work event, or I don't want to do this thing, or my neighbors are bothering me, or we're always fighting. We're always jealous of one another. There are people taking advantage of, the pastures. And so there was just a lot of that sort of like animosity around the obligations that kind of held them into the community. And of course, all these sort of aspirational narratives about, oh, I'm going to take this cash, I'm going to invest it in my kids' education. They're going to become profesionales, like, they're going to be doctors or lawyers or engineers. They're going to come back and lift us out of poverty. Sort of like classic, neoliberal development stuff going on as well. But I think, yeah, the idea was this sort of, many people felt too sort of tamped down by the community and wanted to explore other ways of being.
So you mentioned that people reported feeling like there were changes in body condition. Did you know to ask about that, or is that something that just came up?
Yeah, it just came up because people talk a lot about how their bodies feel. I mean, if you can imagine, these are women in their 60s and 70s who are like running 8 miles a day. And so there were a lot, you sort of like the way that you almost greet other women in the community. Yeah, I mean, I could only be up there for 10 days at a time. I had to go down and eat as much food as I possibly could and go back up because it's just grueling. And so, yeah, this way of greeting other women in the pasture was often like, oh, my feet are hurting. Like, how are your feet doing? Like, ooh, my waist, And so I just kind of was around a lot of these, narratives and discourses of bodily health. something that people really wanted to talk to me about. And then I just started to think about the ways that their narratives were kind of shifting as they saw all these other things happening.
Curious for some of the graduate students here, I think some of them, not doing work in the Andes necessarily, but interested in sort of climate change and livelihoods, impacts and things like that. Are there kind of theoretical bodies of work that you draw from and are informed by, or specific scholars or things that come to mind that you might recommend that they look into?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there is like a very robust climate change anthropology body of literature. A lot of it is around kind of this like adaptation of different sort of cultural systems to climate change. And a lot of it is around kind of drivers of climate change. So anthropologists working within kind of fossil fuel industries and things like that, trying to understand like what are the cultural logics that are creating this sort of crisis in the first place. I mean, off the top of my head, I could rattle off a bajillion names, but I could also just send you some sort of resources. But I've been really inspired in working kind of in the multi-species literature of anthropology. So people like Anna Singh, Donna Haraway, folks who are thinking really critically about kind of those relationships that we have with other beings on this planet, and how that starts to shift in the Anthropocene, and how that can kind of inform us about what's happening.
We have one last burning question. Yeah.
I just- In addition to climate change, do you think that there was a large influence from globalization, sort of developing those roads, or maybe importing, or that kind of remittance cash back? Like, I guess that's sort of what I'm like the balance of globalization with climate change, and those two factors kind of together, how a culture can live well in response to those is something that, it's not really a question, I guess, but.
No, it's a great point. And I think, the story in the Andes begins a little bit earlier with like the wool export economy. So like in the 1970s, that started to really pick up. And then by the 2000s, that was like all the development agencies were like teaching herders how to produce these like, model alpacas that will produce like really fine wool that they can sell to Italy and all of that. And so they've kind of been like wrapped up in these things. It's taken on new nuances, I think now, especially with like Peru is really trying to brand itself. Like there literally is a Marca Peru, like there's like a Peruvian branding campaign that is all about being like, we have this beautiful alpaca wool, like look at our indigenous producers. And so I think they're like getting wrapped up in kind of a new economy that's very image based, and that's kind of creating an interesting dynamic too, because it's very much like, oh no, you should definitely like stay indigenous, right? Like that's what they're hearing from this economy, but also, be a savvy entrepreneur and, make all this cash and have your kids be professionals and things like that. So it's really complex interplay of a bunch of things.
Are you able to stick around for a few minutes if people have other things?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, join me in thanking Allie. And Allie, stick around for a few more minutes if people want to chat afterwards. Thanks for coming, everybody.